In 1973, Israel and the Arab states went to war. In response to Western support for Israel, OPEC held back oil production, plunging the world into a global energy crisis. Inflation soared, long lines became the norm outside of petrol stations, and the economy ground to a halt. The Western dependency on Arab oil was exposed. In 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine, which has sent oil prices surging to the highest level in 8 years, raised gas prices by 62%, and has exposed Europe's dependency on Russian energy. With 40% of its gas and 25% of its oil coming from Russia, Europe needs alternatives, especially with the rising danger of either sanctions or Russia cutting off the energy supply. How can Europe end its dependency on Russian energy? And what complications make this so difficult? Find out in this video. If you enjoy this content, hit that subscribe button as well as the bell notification. Dependency. If the devastating sanctions package represented a divorce between the European Union and the Russian Federation, then Europe's continued dependency on Russian energy is the alimony payment. While the US and UK announced sanctions on Russian energy imports, these countries only imported a small share of their energy from Russia to begin with. While the EU has already banned Russian coal, the EU is still dependent on Russia for 40% of its gas and 25% of its oil supply. So while the EU has imposed sanctions on virtually every other economic sector in Russia, energy alone accounts for 62% of all EU imports from Russia. In other words, the majority of EU imports from Russia remain unsanctioned. What this means in practice is that EU nations are putting $285 million a day in Putin's pocket just to pay for oil, which amounts to $104 billion a year. Gas imports add another $43 billion. For comparison, the entire Russian military budget is $61 billion. With 40% of the Russian government budget being financed by energy revenues, Europe is essentially directly financing the Russian war machine in Ukraine. Moving away from Russian energy would therefore be the only effective way to defund Russia's war effort. But that's not the only reason. Russia has repeatedly threatened to use energy as a weapon, threatening to cut off gas supplies to Europe. This would be devastating for European countries and would hit some nations far more than others. There are at least 5 European countries that are more than 90% dependent on Russian gas. If Putin cut off gas in the middle of winter, energy prices would go through the roof, millions would freeze, and the economy would grind to a halt. However, energy is Russia's primary source of revenue, and so cutting off gas would hurt Russia almost as much as it would hurt the EU. On top of that, even at the height of the Cold War, Russia has never broken a gas contract with the EU. Yet there are other ways for Putin to weaponize energy exports. Putin recently announced that so-called unfriendly nations must pay for gas imports in rubles instead of in euros. This maneuver has single-handedly revived the Russian currency. Before the war, the ruble traded at 77 rubles to the dollar, before declining by 40% to 138 rubles to the dollar. But after this measure, the ruble has recovered, trading at 83 rubles to the dollar. This will reverse some of the effect of the sanctions. Therefore, Europe must do everything in its power to end its dependency on Russian gas for moral, economic, environmental, and security reasons. A good start would be to increase the amount of gas and oil in Europe's strategic reserves. The EU gas storage is currently only 27% full. In response, the EU has announced new rules that require every country to fill up their reserves to 90% by October 1st in preparation for the winter. Similarly, measures should be taken to increase energy efficiency and decrease energy use. The EU imports 155 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia. If the EU doubled the current pace of replacing gas boilers with electric heat pumps, it would cost about $15 billion and save 2 billion cubic meters of gas within the first year. Turning down the thermostat in all buildings by just 1 degree Celsius could save another 10 billion cubic meters of gas per year. But that's just not enough. Ultimately, Europe will have to find alternative energy sources. The EU has announced a plan to cut dependence on Russian energy by 2/3 within 1 year. This is an extremely ambitious, frankly unrealistic goal. But if the EU is to get even close to that, it must use any means necessary. Domestic sources. In the 1960s and 70s, Europe was producing roughly the same amount of natural gas that it was using. But for a variety of reasons, things have changed. North Sea gas deposits have declined since the 1970s. Norway accounts for 24% of the EU's gas imports, yet Norway is already delivering gas at maximum export capacity, and its state-owned energy company, Equinor, is unlikely to pursue further oil and gas exploration due to the government's climate commitments. But there is still another gas field that can be exploited, the Groningen gas fields of the Netherlands. But this could have serious political implications. Gas extraction in this region has long caused subsidence and earth tremors, which has slowly destroyed many people's homes. The failure of the government to adequately compensate these people for damages and continued broken promises to end gas extraction has totally destroyed the trust in political institutions in Groningen and generated massive political opposition to gas extraction. However, there has been a temporary reprieve, with a new poll of the region showing that 60% of Groningers are prepared to continue gas extraction in order to reduce gas dependency. This may not last, however, as the initial outrage at Russia's invasion gives way to old concerns. To mitigate political opposition, the Dutch government must offer larger and more effective compensation measures in order to regain the trust of the population. Indeed, 90% of respondents want gas profits to be put into a compensation fund. This is not just the case in the Netherlands, but also in other gas-producing areas such as Lancashire in the UK, where fracking was halted when it resulted in localized earthquakes. So while there are some options to increase domestic gas production in Europe, there are serious political concerns, and it just won't be enough to substitute away from Russia. So what about foreign imports? For both oil and gas, Europe has a range of options, each coming with their own risks and issues. Most of the gas that comes from Russia comes through pipelines. This makes it difficult to build new pipelines from other sources, as it would take many years, cost billions of euros, and would simply be unfeasible for any supplier not immediately adjacent to Europe. The alternative to this is liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which can be transported by sea. The United States has agreed to ship an additional 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to Europe by the end of this year. This will make the United States a lot of money, but it won't solve Europe's problems. Europe simply lacks the necessary infrastructure to fully replace Russian gas with LNG. You see, to import LNG, you need special terminals that can reconvert the LNG from its liquid form back into gas. The EU only has 21 large-scale LNG terminals, and Germany has 0. This is only enough capacity to import 40% of Europe's gas needs. Building these facilities takes years and costs billions, and on top of that, there is only a limited supply of the kind of ships that can transport LNG. Therefore, expanding LNG infrastructure will be critical, but it won't be enough. On top of that, LNG is far more expensive than importing gas through pipelines, and so using more LNG will send gas prices through the roof. Another option is expanding imports coming through gas pipelines from countries near Europe like Azerbaijan, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Azerbaijan currently exports 8 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe, but it has the capacity to expand this to 10 billion. Algeria is Europe's third largest source of gas, providing 55 billion cubic meters, or 11% of the total, mostly through pipelines. This could expand somewhat by 7 billion, yet this is not as much as it could be. In fact, one of the 3 gas pipelines from Algeria to Europe is actually closed. This is the Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline, which passes through Morocco and was closed when Algeria severed diplomatic ties with Morocco over the Western Sahara dispute. Europe should do everything in its power to resolve this dispute and reopen the pipeline. Libya is unable to increase either its oil or gas exports to Europe as a result of the ongoing political instability in the country caused by the Western-led overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. The chickens have come home to roost. Egypt is at a maximum export capacity, which still leaves the Eastern Mediterranean gas field between Cyprus, Egypt, and Israel. This $6 billion pipeline still needs to be constructed and could carry up to 12 billion cubic meters of gas. but it looks increasingly unlikely as the United States has pulled support from the project in January 2022 for environmental reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons, as Turkey was excluded from the project, inflaming geopolitical tensions in the region. A more long-term prospect would be the Trans-Saharan pipeline, which would connect Nigeria's vast gas fields to Algeria and by extension to Europe. But this project is still years away. So what about oil? It's much easier to substitute away from Russian oil, as oil does not require pipelines and European countries already have the infrastructure to handle oil from oil tankers. Saudi Arabia is the biggest producer in OPEC, the oil cartel which controls 60% of the world's oil trade. But where Europe sees disaster, the Saudis and OPEC see opportunity. OPEC has refused to increase oil production. And what this means is that by deliberately holding back production, they will artificially increase prices, making more money for themselves and increasing prices for European consumers. If OPEC were to increase oil production, they could actually fill in the gap left by Russia. The EU imports about 15 million barrels of oil per day, of which about 3.5 million come from Russia. OPEC nations are estimated to have 4 million barrels per day of additional production capacity, which could plug the gap within a few years. Yet even with the best diplomatic maneuvering, OPEC is unlikely to increase production by this much. Therefore, alternative sources are needed. The best way is to lift sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. Iran has spare production capacity of 1.3 million barrels per day. Lifting sanctions would allow 500,000 barrels to come online immediately, while it would take about a year to get the remaining production online. The only reason these sanctions were in place was because the United States, under Trump, unilaterally pulled out of the Iran deal, despite the fact that Iran held on to the terms of the deal. The West must immediately step back into the deal and lift sanctions in order to get Iranian oil back on the market. However, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are strongly against this, which could incentivize them to hold back oil production or try to jeopardize the deal. The same applies to Venezuela, which has the largest reserves of oil in the world. Sanctions on Venezuela were imposed in response to the repression of Nicolás Maduro's government. While the repression is very real, in truth that wasn't the reason. After all, if we cared about democracy, we wouldn't be buying oil from Saudi Arabia. In truth, the sanctions were imposed because Venezuela had an anti-Western government and attempted to implement socialist policies, with the US wanting regime change. Venezuela has not violated international law, invaded any country, or committed any genocide. There is therefore little reason for these sanctions to be in place, and so the US and EU must immediately lift sanctions and recognize Maduro's government. Talks between Venezuela and the US have already begun. There are two problems, however. Firstly, the combination of corruption and sanctions have led to a severe decline in Venezuelan oil production from 2.2 million barrels per day during the Chavez era to just 800,000 today. This means that it will take several years and lots of investment for Venezuela's oil production to reach pre-crisis levels. Secondly, Venezuelan oil is extremely heavy, which requires special types of refineries. European refineries are built to handle Russian and Middle Eastern oil, but only the United States has enough capacity to refine Venezuelan oil. The way to get around this would be for the United States to import oil from Venezuela instead of Europe. The US would then either refine the oil and re-export it to Europe, or simply export its own oil and use Venezuelan oil for domestic consumption. Yet even if all these measures are taken, energy prices will remain high, and Europe will have to import some Russian energy. Therefore, non-fossil fuel alternatives are needed. The nuclear option. With gas supplies from Russia looking increasingly insecure, several European countries have announced that they will reopen coal-fired power stations. This is unconscionable. Coal-powered energy is the dirtiest and most dangerous source of energy we have, and principally responsible for global warming. A return to coal would drastically undermine our climate commitments, which are time-sensitive. It's one thing to substitute existing oil and gas usage from Russia to other sources, but it's another thing to increase fossil fuel usage by returning to coal. And the principal reason for this is the refusal of some European leaders to embrace low-carbon nuclear energy. Now, some countries are reversing course. Belgium has delayed its plans to phase out nuclear energy by 10 years, extending the deadline from 2025 to 2035. Poland's president has hailed a nuclear partnership with the United States. Yet one country stubbornly refuses to sacrifice the sacred cow of nuclear energy: Germany. In 2011, Angela Merkel ordered the phased shutdown of all nuclear power plants in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown. This resulted in Germany increasing coal-fired power generation and becoming more reliant on Russian gas, both an environmental and a geopolitical catastrophe. Today, Germany has only 3 nuclear power plants left that are planned for shutdown in 2022 and 2023. Even after the invasion, the Germans have refused to delay the shutdown of these nuclear power plants, with the primary reason that the shutdown is already in an advanced stage and the power plants don't have enough nuclear fuel to bring them back online for the coming winter. But this misses the point that they could still be brought back online for future winters and contribute to ending Germany's dependency on Russia without resorting to coal-fired energy. Now you might be asking, what about the risks of nuclear energy, namely nuclear waste, which has to be stored underground for thousands of years, and the danger of nuclear accidents? The truth is that coal-fired energy is far more dangerous to the planet than nuclear. How many people do you think died during the Fukushima nuclear disaster? 1 person. That's right, 1 person died. Yet coal-fired energy is responsible for 800,000 deaths worldwide every single year. In 2018 alone, fossil fuels killed 8.7 million people. Nuclear energy, including Chernobyl, has only killed 30 to 60,000 people in the entire history of the world. In total, nuclear energy results in 99% fewer deaths than coal, oil, and gas-powered energy. Germany's shutdown of nuclear energy led to increased coal use, which resulted in an additional 1,100 deaths per year in Germany from air pollution. It is therefore criminally irresponsible for a German government, which includes a so-called Green Party, to reject nuclear energy in favor of coal. France produces 70% of its electricity using nuclear power, and as a result, its power stations produce 10 times fewer carbon emissions than Germany, and it is free from Russian dependency. European countries must embrace the French example to both save the planet and save Ukraine. But nuclear power is, of course, not the only option. Green energy. If energy security and climate ambition come into conflict with one another, it is the climate that will lose out. Therefore, we must incorporate green energy into our strategy and reframe the transition to green energy as a wartime transition. Investing maximally in green energy is now not just a climate priority, but a necessity for European energy security. European governments and the EU must fast-track all the necessary permits for installing wind and solar energy, reduce regulations, increase subsidies for green energy, public transport and electric vehicles, and invest more in research on energy storage technology to make green energy more viable. Indeed, the fact that wind and solar energy don't produce electricity when there's no wind or sun means that a backup source of energy is needed. In the past, that was gas. Now it will have to be nuclear. New wind and solar projects could replace 20 billion cubic meters of EU gas use this year already. Tripling capacity by 2030 could save 170 billion cubic meters a year. Indeed, Germany has committed 200 billion euros to bring forward its goal of 100% renewable energy from 2050 to 2035. Other European countries should follow suit. However, we should be aware that moving away from one dependency doesn't create another. Rare earth minerals are critical components in the production of electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. At present, China controls 60% of the world's rare earth mining and 85% of the processing of these minerals. On top of that, 90% of wafer manufacturing used in solar panels is controlled by China, while 80% of global battery cell manufacturing capacity is in Chinese hands. If Europe is to have a sustainable future with green energy, it must secure alternative sources for these minerals and build up its own domestic processing capacity. Working class solidarity. The pursuit of alternatives to Russian energy must not come at the expense of the working classes of Europe. These measures will increase energy prices. Solidarity with Ukraine must be paired with solidarity with working people if governments want to generate political support for these policies. For this reason, governments should do everything in their power to decrease energy use, but without hurting low-income people economically. The best way to do this is not with price caps or direct subsidies, but instead by redistributing the profits of energy companies. You see, price caps will only result in energy shortages and bankrupt energy companies as energy prices surge. This is in fact exactly what happened in the UK in 2021. Direct subsidies, on the other hand, will keep energy prices low without creating shortages, but would both be very expensive for the government, and it would incentivize people to keep using the same amount of energy instead of reducing consumption. Instead, the government should allow the price to rise, which will prevent shortages and incentivize people to cut back on energy use. But the increased profits of energy companies should then be taxed, and those profits should be redistributed and given back to the people. In this way, people will be incentivized to cut back on energy use, but they won't be made economically worse off because they will be compensated for the price rises. Romania and Italy have already begun implementing such a policy, and the International Energy Agency estimates that such taxes could raise 200 billion euros this year. None of these solutions will on their own end Europe's dependency on Russia. Only in combination can they hope to put a dent in European demand for Russian energy. In pursuit of that goal, Europeans must become open to new ideas and sacrifice holy cows where needed. If there is to be any hope to defund the Russian war machine, we must use any means necessary. To find out why Russia's invasion of Ukraine will backfire, watch this video. Consider donating to Ukrainian humanitarian relief efforts at the link below. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons including Matthias, Linda, Richard, Eisenskjold, and many more for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.